Greetings all, and welcome to the 19th episode of the V.T.P, or the Veteran Trainer's Perspective. Today, we're going to be looking at an aspect of the Pokémon world that is seen here and there in bits and pieces, but is never fully addressed by the main series games, and even spin-offs all that much, despite it being vital to the way the Pokémon world actually functions. Today, we'll be examining the way that government functions in the world of Pokémon, and how they might impact the reality of the world as a whole as a reflection of our own.
The world of Pokémon is by far not a small place, but one as large and thriving as our own, as seen in media outside the main series games. And for the most part, it all seems to be working just fine without major issues to the eye of the unaware individual. Businesses thrive, people can live their lives in peace, but as with any world, there is still always crime and other acts that serve to bring the population's safety and well-being down. We have seen that there are police forces that work to mobilize officers to stop criminals in their tracks, and this is all well and good, but there is a question that needs to be asked here. Who exactly is paying these officers? They could be out there risking their lives for whatever they know on any night, and it's not an easy job. The paperwork alone can be quite horrendous from what I've heard. There's no reason to think that the police forces of the Pokémon world are any different from our own in that respect. But if that is indeed the case, then the question must be asked here, who is paying to keep these services intact? There always must be an incentive of some sort to defending the lives of others, but when there is risk involved, it cannot be expected that others will always be willing to volunteer their lives for the cause. So, again, I ask, who is giving these incentives? Who is making sure as much as they can that this world is taken care of at any level of society? Point blank, what is the government of the Pokémon world that funds all of this like?
Well, as it turns out, even with fan theories abounding as to what is actually going on, there at least is one thought that stands out as something I think just makes sense, at least on paper.
The idea of a government existing in the Pokémon world is never really directly addressed in a blatant fashion, but it seems to be the case that traditional elections are not a common occurrence. Moreover, the regions that have been introduced to the main series and spin-offs alike don't seem to have much in the way of political unity, as the different regions can very well be seen as isolated entities that can govern themselves well without the need for a larger major government to make decisions or otherwise alter the region. This means that the different regions are able to govern themselves as sovereign nations of a sort, completely isolated from others, from everything excluding geography in some cases. But even with that said, there is no notice of a traditional modern government as we know as existing, or at least not a pure democracy. What we do see though is that powerful officials in the Pokémon League seem to hold great power in not just their respective towns and cities, but also in terms of the way they can control local politics in their area. They are also well known by everyone in their area and even elsewhere, and given that Pokémon battling is not the end-all be-all sportive activity of choice for people in the world, it suggests that they must have more control and influence to them outside of simply being powerful trainers. As such, this all seems to suggest that these trainers as a whole are acting in place of a local government, chosen as officials not because of their political clout or desire to shape their communities, but by a combination of their battling prowess and skill, and the charisma with which they can hold themselves in public and private settings, even if they are defeated in battle. These individuals, then, are the ones seemingly in charge for the most part, and work with their people rather than just for them.
However, if this is the case, it still begs another question to be asked here, going back to the first one on police officers. Who is actually paying for their services? And to expand that question, let's take a look at all the organizations and places that seem to be in the business of coin in each and every location and region.
On the one hand, it could be said that the leader of a town or city could be responsible for gathering up money and making sure that everyone is getting paid for their services, but what then of the towns that lack these officials? How exactly do things work in that scenario? Well, the simplest answer would be that they are getting paid based on their services to others directly from each other on a more individual basis. Pokémon battling is a good example, since you are working to defeat an opponent to be paid by them for money, an exchange of something of value to show that you have done good work and deserve to be paid for it. This works on a case-by-case basis from town to town, city to city, and all seems to be fine on their own with no need of assistance from any official ruling body. As such, it would not be totally wrong to say that the governments of these regions are more like socialist states of a sort, communities that can work together but otherwise are able to stay self-sufficient without requiring the help of other sovereign states. In this scenario, then, it could be said that the strongest trainers of the region, such as the Elite Four and Champion, then act as higher officials in the stance that look over the performance of the different communities in their given region and work to ensure that everything is staying stable, but especially doing so without interfering in the communities unless it is deemed completely necessary. As such, they would wield great power, but would also be obligated to not get involved unless there is no other way to solve an ongoing issue in a community. There would be no oligarchy in this case, merely a group of people chosen on the same merits as the lesser leaders below them that in turn work to serve the larger region community in conjunction with the smaller communities that comprise said regions.
This seems like something pulled from fiction on its own merit, I'll agree to that. But at the same time, it is something that is also proven to not be entirely fictitious in real life, at least in the case of celebrities holding powerful positions of political office in their own place of residence.
It's become increasingly common in places across the world, and it shows, at least to me, a changing face to how the world chooses its elected officials and thus the kinds of people they want put in charge of running everything. Trusted individuals with experience and the like have been valued increasingly less by the many in the world, preferring to elect someone just because some like their policies, rather than thinking of what is good for a country as a whole. Now, that in and of itself is not new. Lobbying has been a thing for ages. But it does mean that people are given positions of power, even if they might not seem like they actually have the experience to adequately do the job, or at least not without serious controversy.
And while it is true that in many of these cases these people are still indeed being elected and not simply chosen based on their skills and policies, well, take a step back for a moment. Does that really make them so different from the proposed form of government for the Pokémon world? Does it really?
The gym leaders of a region, or even the Elite Four and Champion, do acquire the positions from people, and while it is not exactly an elected job, as you might think of in a modern democracy, they are still being given these positions based on their skills as a trainer and their overall capacity to keep the communities going over experience and a sense of job competency. This means that they are being given these positions on charisma, yes, but at the same time, the merit of their talents and behavior towards others. It's a sort of pseudo-meritocracy in that regard, and since that tends to dominate a lot more higher-tiered governments in the world, the reality of the situation is not completely removed from reality. They have done great things that people respect them for, and the communities choose them based on these merits. Elections in democracies are not that much different at their core foundation, so the world of Pokémon and the way it is run is not entirely socialist, but also partially based on at least some democratic and meritocratic policies.
Like any real government, it is also noted that there have been instances where it has failed to do its job and seems to be incapable, or at the very least not well equipped, to handle those that wish to subvert the foundation to destroy it entirely through multiple channels of influence. Probably the most classic example of this goes all the way back to the days of Red and Green with the introduction of Team Rocket.
Team Rocket were seen basically as a form of organized crime who used legal operations, such as the Celadon Game Corner, in order to fund their more illegal operations beneath the facility and across the greater Kanto region as a whole. As many have noticed, however, the local ruling government did not really do much about it, and there are a couple reasons why. First of all, as stated, the underground operations of Team Rocket were kept mostly a secret prior to their invasion of Silphco, and their above-ground operations were illegal, so there wasn't a lot of hard evidence present that any of the main gym leaders or Elite Four could directly act upon in the games. Secondly, the organization had an ace in the hole in that their boss, Giovanni, was a gym leader himself, and used it as a front for his operations, and could thus directly influence and even control any investigation that came into order, allowing Team Rocket to go relatively scot-free in any instance. And third, even as a gym leader, Giovanni tended to remain elusive, so it was hard to track him down and confront him on the subject, allowing him more than enough time to plan out escapes and loopholes that can get him personally out of any sticky situation that he was a part of. This kind of behavior is legendary among crime families of all sorts across the world, and cultures aside, it is something that elevated him far above the lackeys that worked under him, enough that even years later during the resurgence of Team Rocket in the Johto region, the movement could not really get as far as hoped by its members as they did not feel it would be proper or possible to succeed if the leader did not return to rule over the organization once again. Generation 5 also gave us a look at another reality that is just as terrifying in the main games of Black and White as it often is in the real world: a military coup. Team Plasma and its true leader, Getsis, seem to be working under the banner of protecting Pokémon, led by the manipulator man only known as N, and this is a common ploy used by groups that wish to overthrow their government. They use propaganda in order to make themselves look much more reliable, trustworthy, and effective than those that are currently in power, manipulating the beliefs of the masses in order to bring them under their wing and use that political power to justify their attempt to overthrow the establishment and install themselves as the new seat of power.
Of course, just as it goes in many cases, this is far from the truth, as it is revealed eventually at the end of Black and White that Getsis was simply desiring to rule over the entire region as a true dictator, using N as a puppet king, giving him full control over the Unova region as he saw fit.
However, Getsis' own affairs proved to be a bit too much reliant on the thought that those in charge of keeping the region intact would allow for such a thing to go unnoticed, as at the end of the games, most of the gym leaders come to the castle event at the very end to keep the 7 sages of Team Plasma from interrupting the main player's efforts to find and defeat N and Getsis to end the conflict. There was a sneaky bit of reality thrown in on the sequel games as well, as while Getsis was basically deposed from his position, from afar he continued to wield great power among his followers and attempted a coup yet again, this time with much more force and power than before, having taken control of Qrem. This is a nice piece of symbolism that shows that these sorts of leaders can still have great charisma to them and their ideology even in defeat, showing the kind of power they truly have over others. The events that occurred in the following generation in the Kalos region were a nice throwback in a way to the days of Team Rocket, in that the actions of Team Flare were indeed hidden in their intentions and preparation thanks to an inside source. In this case, the inside source came in the form of Malva of the Elite Four. Malva not only served as a frontwoman for the technology and news brought forth by Lysander and his work, but also kept press coverage of the events of the game to a bit of a minimum to allow Team Flare to work without the eyes of the authorities on them at all times. And even after Team Flare is actually defeated, Malva still proves to be quite useful to the international police and tracking down the last members of the group still working behind the scenes. It's made quite clear that she's never happy about everything that she was robbed of for future possibilities because of the player's actions, but it was at least nice to see that she was willing to flip and betray the group to save her own skin and keep her out of jail. A rat is a rat, but at least she did some good to the world through it.
All of these groups stand out in that they are not initially targeted by the local governments as a source of problems, with Team Magma, Aqua, and Galactic all being looked at with at least some level of scrutiny once things got bad for them. It is noted that Generations 7 and 8 do stand out from all of this, as the roots of the group responsible for causing havoc are actually a bit more complicated to explain.
On the one hand, the group known as Team Yell did seem to serve a villainous organization purpose at first, but much like Team Skull, they really weren't. Skull was just a bunch of kids that banded together after failing the island challenge, while the members of Team Yell were just fans of Marnie, led by her brother, the Dark-type gym leader Piers. However, it is the tail end of the adventure where things take a bit of a turn. In Generation 7 it is made clear in Sun and Moon that the Aether Foundation is the true villain of the story, but not even to their own fault, as their head Lucamine had been manipulated by Nihilego. Even in the sequel games, she still proved to be foolhardy in her attempts to find and control Necrozma, setting her up as more of a tragic figure than anything else, trying to do what they believed was right. With Generation 8, however, the true motivations of everything involved is something that very few actually know about. In fact, it isn't until the tail end of the main campaign that we find out that the real villain is the group Macrocosmos, which is funny since they are responsible for much of the industrialization of the entire Galar region, at least in modern times. What makes this interesting is that, or at least in the Alola region, the island kahunas and others show that there is indeed a working government that is intended to help keep peace between the different islands. In the case of the Galar region, Macrocosmos, for all intents and purposes, is the government of the region by the sheer control they have over the products they use in Galar on a daily basis. And even then, they can't really be seen as truly villainous in their propositions, as the only person that seems to be directing everything is Chairman Rose, with the rest of the sort just following along out of their job or loyalty, not that different from Cyrus and Team Galactic. And even then, it was all because Rose thought he was doing a favor for the future of the region. But with all due respect to the guy, trying to harness the power of an ancient radioactive space dragon might not have been the brightest idea despite his success with the company as a whole.
Now, all of this, of course, just covers the local governments and the police forces that work with them. This, however, is not all that there is, as there is one entity that has made itself known multiple times throughout the series, but whose actual functions are still relatively unknown. The International Police.
This group was introduced all the way back to the first generation, but only became truly prominent in Generation 4, with the introduction of Looker, one of the most well-known agents. On the surface, people can be forgiven for looking at the group and simply shrugging their shoulders, given that they tend to only act when there is something afoot that the local governments in a region cannot handle, either for political reasons or because they just don't have the warrants to issue any sort of legal investigation. This might bring people back to the likes of James Bond and other spy movie secret agent shticks, but given the way that the group is run and the way that the regional governments are run, there might be something just a tad off. Simply put, the issue here is twofold. On the one hand, as I said, they only seem to appear when there are situations the local governments and police forces simply are not equipped to handle or investigate, but in doing so, they often skirt through legal boundaries and use precedent and information alone in order to act, which isn't exactly the most comforting thought. Sure, that might mean getting the bad guys and gals in the video game sooner and before disaster strikes, but it also is subverting the rule of law on several fronts and makes it seem like these groups legally are being denied privacy rights that they have with business fronts and the like.
It's a good thing in the game, sure, but it's also the kind of thing that can cause operations to backfire if international agents so much as make a mistake in their paperwork or their actions. After all, the law is still the law, no matter what the threat at hand may be.
And on the other hand, it has to be asked just where they're getting their funds from. It is quite clear that the group makes a lot of travel plans and indeed is called international for a reason, but who exactly is paying for all of this? To me, the simplest explanation would be that it's a funding system that is shared among multiple groups in the world, like every region chipping in to finance them for the sake of what they can do. But if this is the case, as outlined in the previous point, this is paying a group that may or may not break the law just to achieve what they themselves would see as justice in order to save the world and all that. Again, they did great things, but this is still the same mechanically as paying money to a mob to find evidence of someone and put them away for a long time, or even worse. This is once again reflected from reality, as in my land of origin, the United States, there have been more than a few cases where certain groups have been paid off to take care of others in order to gain favor and funding for these sorts of operations, so there is more than a bit of quid pro quo in the possibilities here. Though this is also just merely speculation, as nothing concrete has ever been given in the Pokémon world.
So, we've seen now how the government of the Pokémon world likely operates, and the ways that have been handled and attacked over the years. But if you took away these villainous groups and left things as they were, you'd be forgiven for thinking that all would be right with the Pokémon world on this hypothesized socio-political structure, enough that it possibly could work in the real world. Except, that is not certain to be the case.
See, when it comes to socialism, it is important to note that the policies of this political way of thinking and operating can be good in the right circumstances and support. However, I use that phrasing specifically because in certain situations, meaning that in a more broader general sense, they don't always work out well. Now, in stating this, I must also make a clear distinction that there is an important difference between socialism and communism, as the two are used interchangeably and incorrectly as a result. To put it bluntly, socialism is a concept and a way of thinking that can be used to influence policies. Communism, on the other hand, is basically what happens when nothing but socialist policies are used to structure and create a working government. Socialism is compatible with democracy, and communism is not, to put it simply. With that said, the communal nature of socialism is one that really only works when everyone in society is willing to work with it and accept whatever is given to and taken from them. And as people like Getz show, well, that simply isn't something that everyone can always agree with. The key is that everyone needs to be fair for socialist policies to work, and that rarely ever works in the real world. The Pokémon world is a nice example that I think that socialists could use to prove the system actually works, but it's also clear that, as we have stated before, this is not a pure socialist society, but it's also not exactly something that can be seen as fully democratic either. It's a bit of an odd situation built around the nature of the Pokémon world and how it functions. And that is the key here, what it is built around. The idea of gym leaders, Elite Four, and the like having the power to basically rule over a section of a larger region is built around the idea that they gain this position as an aspect of their skills as a trainer. But this isn't something that exists in the real world, and without that aspect, the system could create issues on the value of individuals versus collectives, among other things, an issue that has been seen in purely socialist states throughout much of modern history. As such, while this all seems like it would work, it is important to make it clear that this is a system that only works for the Pokémon world as it is and would be unlikely to function in a real-world society.
Before we wrap up this episode of the V.T.P., there is one last thing I would like to touch on that should be noted as the one true fact that needs to be clear with all of this analysis.
Everything that is being seen here is pretty much just speculation and analysis. Nothing has been said from the actual creators of the series how the government of the Pokémon world operates. And to their credit, there is a very good reason for that. Politics are a nightmare. Fantasy worlds have skirted through the ideas of politics on more than one occasion, and that's fine, but the difference between them and Pokémon is that the series was intended to be very kid-friendly from the start, and needed a simple base to build upon for the franchise to even get going. To inject politics into something means to take a stance or an opinion of a specific political form, and while it might not have been the issue at hand originally, since the games were made simply to play and have fun with, over the years the developers of the games have been careful not to put any one sort of political position into the games. On a monetary basis alone, this makes sense, as you do want to make good sales, which means you need to include as little information as possible that may be likely to upset or anger people in different parts of the world. This is shown more than once as an example in the way that Pokémon and trainer sprites were altered for international releases in order to minimize any trouble certain aspects could cause. And even if you look beyond the sales numbers at the core of it all, I think there is a recognition that going anywhere near politics would be a bad idea, even just culturally speaking. Japan is known for being very inward thinking, focusing on themselves and their constituents more than they focus on us, and it's understandable given the country's history with isolationist policies. However, in a wider demographic, time must be spent to analyze and see what will help to make something more appealing to a wider audience to get the product out there on store shelves, and politics is a subject more than likely to crash influence and the reach of a product. So it's not just the product that's in danger, it's the way that these companies conduct their business, and if it is only done in a certain way, that limits what they can do with said product and where they can take it. All in all, it is just something that is fun to speculate on, but there are good reasons for it to never be directly addressed in-game in most, if not all, cases.
Politics and the way they are dealt with in any game is a tricky tightrope to walk, and always fraught with danger. But in the case of the world of Pokémon, it can be seen that the system in place at least works for their world, even if it might not be best suited for our own. Even so, it is interesting to think on the way everything must run, and how that can change the way that others view the franchise and the way it is built upon in time, one region at a time. Where the series goes next on that front is unclear, but you can bet that we'll be sticking around and watching and waiting for more information to analyze. Until then, keep your stations tuned and keep on watching for the next episode of the V.T.P. Thank you all for watching this video. It is always a pleasure to help teach others about the world of Pokémon and the many facets of it that exist in both the world we call home and the world they call home. If you'd like, please leave a comment and subscribe and ring the bell to this channel to get regular updates on content and anything else that might be going on. You can find me and my written work on DeviantArt under the name Titus, and be informed of information and content uploads on my Twitter page and my Patreon page. Donations are always welcome. Always remember, the world of Pokémon is a vast and varied place, and there's no telling what secrets might be hiding just around the corner. So keep watch, stay vigilant, and always prepare for the unexpected. Until next time, have a wonderful rest of the day.